Hello, welcome to the sideboard here at the StarCityGames.com Open Series in Indianapolis. I'm Nick Miller alongside Braun. Duin. How you doing, sir?
Good, how are you?
Pretty good. Now, the entire Roanoke crew, for the most part, is on this Abzan Aggro deck that you have designed, and they have been tweaking since, for the most part.
Yeah, so actually, most people start with like Siege Rhino and Anafenza, and then they maybe get to here.
Right.
I actually started with a 5-color deck and dropped it back down to a 4-color deck, and then I took it even further and made it like a 3-color deck with a splash.
Right. Or is it other people are starting small, building up, you're taking it back down?
Yeah, I started big and built it back down.
Right. Well, Abzan Aggro was probably the dominant deck, or one of 3 dominant decks of the last format. It's fitting that it's still here. You have a lot of the same pieces.
Yep.
But you also have got some new cards to work with. So, Warden of the Forest Tree, a card that, you know, Andy Boswell was using the whole time, but now you have gone full bore on for.
Yeah, so Warden kind of fills the role that Fleecemane Lion used to fill, where it's just a 3/3 creature, and Warden actually is in some situations better than Fleecemane Lion because you can begin attacking for 3 as early as turn 2, whereas Fleecemane was just like getting played on turn 2. And because of the nature of fetches and the new dual lands, you can actually pretty easily curve Warden into level up into 3 Anafenza or whatever. It's actually really easy to make that curve out. So it's actually, Warden is probably one of the best cards in the deck. And almost any opening hand that has a green source and a Warden is just going to be really good.
Okay. You've got Hangerback Walker, of course, as most decks do these days. Abzan Aggro adopted that as soon as it came out. Anafenza, a bunch of those, and Siege Rhino, of course. The usual Abzan cards we expect to see.
Yep.
But we have New Gideon here. This is the card that in the Versus videos, Brad and yourself have been pretty much promoting as the best card. 3 copies in this deck. How's it been now that you've gotten about 5 rounds under your belt?
It's been good. It's not it's not as good as I thought it was going to be. It's generally speaking worse than Siege Rhino, but it's still a very good card, and it has a lot of utility in various situations where there have been a number of times where I've been able to play it and make an emblem just to get a Den Protector big enough to attack through my opponent's blockers, which has been enough to win some games. So it does do a lot of things, and it's a very powerful card. Originally they were Woodland Wanderers, but we ended up switching to Gideon just as a more versatile card, although Wanderer has a more, has like a higher threshold of how good it can be.
Being a much bigger vigilant trample threat, but this has a lot more versatility.
Yep.
All right. Abzan Charm, we've seen that. Jamoka's Command, we've seen that. Valor Stance, Murder's Cut, all these are, the usual tools, but the interesting thing about what Abzan Aggro has done is the mana base.
Yep.
You now have this fetch battle land mana base that the deck didn't have before. You don't have so many temples and all these things, so your mana base is a lot more fluid, and it allows this interesting blue splash in the sideboard. So talk about the idea of pushing to blue, and this card especially, Exert Dominance. Influence, sorry.
Yep.
The new control magic that has just been an all-star for all you guys playing this deck.
Yeah, so I wanted my mana base to come into play untapped. I wanted to be able to curve out every game. We played like 8 to 10 tap lands in the last format, but that was more out of necessity than like what you wanted to do. Like playing a tap land deck with the Warden of the First Tree is just kind of inefficient. But now with fetch lands and the battle lands, you can like fetch a basic, and then every subsequent fetch or battle land always comes into play untapped, and you can just pretty easily curve out. And as a result, blue is almost a free splash. Like a Sunken Hollow is something that lets your Flooded Strand fetch a black source, and things like that. And we have Smoldering March, which lets Wooded Foothills fetch a black source. So there's like a number of ways where these extra dual lands allow fetch lands to be even more versatile, and it just results in blue splash being basically free, which lets us play some blue cards in sideboard like Exert Influence that you talked about. It's just an extremely powerful card in mid-range mirrors where you can just a lot of times like the Abzan mirror comes down to like they play a creature, you kill it. They play a creature, you kill it. They play a creature, you kill it. And Exert Influence lets you like just go one step beyond that, where it's like they play a creature, you kill it. They play a creature, you kill it. They play a creature, you steal it. And now they have to kill their own creature, and it just gives you an enormous like card advantage and tempo boost.
And with your mana base, you have all the colors in the mana base, so you can get that pretty big to take any threat you really want.
Yeah.
Of course, you also have Disdainful Stroke as your other blue splash.
Yeah, Disdainful Stroke's just a really powerful card, and it's nice for Abzan to have access to a card like that because in a lot of matchups like the control decks or ramp decks, you're kind of at a disadvantage in a lot of cases, but Disdainful Stroke's going to help you out. Countering things like Dig Through Time, Crux of Fate, Languish, all these cards that are just super good against you. You can also just counter, like in other ramp decks, you can counter things like Ugins or, their Dragon Lord Atarkas or things like that would otherwise be a huge problem. Being able to like build your board up and then sit behind a Disdainful Stroke is really powerful.
Right, you were a pretty big champion of this deck in its previous iterations. I'm sure you would have loved to have access to something like Disdainful Stroke to stop, Elspeth or any of the cards you just mentioned that were a pretty big hindrance for the deck.
Yeah, it would have been huge in the last format, but the mana just didn't make it feasible. You'd have to play way too many come and play tap lands or have too many awkward draws. But here, you still have some awkward draws, but for the most part, things are pretty smooth.
Talk about the rest of the mana base and the freedom and the difficulty of building the deck. And I'm sure now one of the issues with playing this deck is knowing how to sequence your lands.
Yeah, actually, building the mana base is really hard. Andrea Mengucci and I sat down for like hours to put the mana base together, and we're still off. The deck's short a few black sources. I can tell playing through the rounds that I've been missing black mana a number of times. So there's still room for improvement there, but it took us forever to get the numbers right. And even beyond that, how you play the lands out in the game is really hard. There have been a number of times where I'd sit there on turn 1 and just tank for 30 seconds trying to figure out, like, I have a Flooded Strand, a Windswept Heath, and a Wooded Foothills. Like, how am I, going to sequence that? And actually, a lot of times it's just fetch basic, fetch a dual land, give you all 3 of your colors. But there's going to be a lot of awkward draws where it's like you have a Sunken Hollow and a fetch land in your hand. How do you sequence it? Maybe you, play the fetch first, or maybe you play the Sunken Hollow. And then what do you do with your next land? Do you fetch for a Canopy Vista, or you just fetch for a forest and hope you eventually draw a white source? There's a lot of sequencing there, and you really have to look at your hand and figure out what your plan is and how you're planning on curving out.
Right. Sure, Hangerback Walker helps out there quite a bit, where the lands, as long as they're untapped, you can at least have a thing to play and then move on from there.
Yeah, Hangerback really helps bridge that a lot, where sometimes you have an awkward hand, but it doesn't matter because it's all colorless.
Sure. So the rest of the sideboard here, as we've touched on the blue splash, you've got Duress and Russian Cleric, just a bunch of cards that we see in a lot of sideboards now that you have access to all the colors.
Yeah.
These are just very powerful spells.
Yeah, I mean, Duress is one of the things about this deck that's really important is being able to double spell, as they call it, where you can cast 2 spells in the same turn. And Duress is a card that lets you do that, as it's just being 1 mana. And Murderous Cut's another card that lets you do that, and because we have so many fetch lands, it's really easy to turn Murderous Cut on. And that's the reason that's in the deck too, is so you can go Anafenza, also cut your guy, or Rhino, also cut your guy. Things like that are what turn a game that's even or maybe a little bit behind into all of a sudden you're winning.
Sure.
And so having access to cheap spells like Duress really help that too in the matchups where it's good. Ration Cleric's just essential against the red decks, which I expect to be pretty popular. And Silk Wrap's just basically for Jeskai predominantly, where you want a removal spell that hits Mana Strider and Jace. But it's also good against a variety of other decks too.
Sure, great against Hangerback and those types of threats too.
Yeah, it's good against Hangerback, it's good against Mono Red, just as a removal spell, so.
Okay, well the deck looks great. The Roanoke crew's on it. They all pointed me to you, so you got the credit for the deck tech and all of that.
I've been working on this deck for the past week, so I'm hoping. I know that it's not optimal at this point, but I do like where it's at compared to where it started, and so there's still more work to be done, but I'm happy so far with how it's playing out.
All right, well we look forward to watching you play it more, and good luck the rest of the tournament, and of course the Pro Tour coming up and all that. So
thank you.
For Braun, Duin, I'm Nick Miller here in the sideboard. Stay tuned to StarCityGames.com all weekend long for the action here in Indianapolis.